So I'd like to introduce the moderator for our first session, Jessica Bennett, who will steer a panel of young activists. Jessica Bennett is the New York Times gender editor-at-large and the author of Feminist Fight Club, a survival manual for a sexist workplace. Jessica, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here with all of you. And I would love to introduce our incredible panelists today. Alexandria Villaseñor is a 15-year-old climate activist in New York City normally, but also in Davis, California, where she's coming to us live today. And it is very early in the morning, her time. So thank you for getting up with us. She's also the founder of Uprising, which works to bring accurate climate science into schools. And we also have Clover Hogan, a 20-year-old climate activist, researcher, and the founder of Force of Nature, which works to inspire young activists. Thank you both for being with us and welcome. So I want to go back to the beginning a bit. As I was putting on my anti-aging serum this morning, I was thinking about how much you both have accomplished and wanted to know what inspired you and what motivated each of you to get here. So Alexandria, let's start with you. Can you tell us a little bit about what inspired you to get here?
2018, when I was visiting my family back in Davis, California, because at the time I was living in New York City while my mom studied at Columbia University. And so I just moved and a lot of my family was still in Davis. So I ended up coming back to visit my family. And during that time, the Paradise Fire broke out in California. And so it quickly became one of California's worst wildfires in its history. Over 250 square miles burned. And it was just devastating. And so my hometown is very close to Paradise, so we ended up receiving a lot of the smoke from that wildfire. At one point, it was the worst air quality in the world, and the smoke was seeping into my home. So my family had to find ways to keep the smoke from coming in. We rolled up wet towels, put them under windows and doors, and it was all around just an unsafe place to be in. And so since I have asthma, I was becoming really sick, and my family made the decision to send me back to New York City from that trip early. And at that point, of course, I was super upset because California is seeing wildfires all year round now, and it's our wildfire season never ends, really. So, of course, I was really upset, and I started to research about California's wildfires, and I saw a wildfire and climate change presentation, and just seeing the science and what was happening made me feel like I had to do something. So I saw Greta Thunberg speak at COP24, and that was the moment when I decided that I needed to do something and take my climate anxiety and eco-grief and turn it into action. And that is why I decided to take my first form of direct action on December 14th of 2018 in the form of a strike.
Amazing. Clover, what about you?
First off, just thank you for being here, and am ever inspired by Alexandria, and also just how young you are. It's absolutely remarkable. So I was very lucky to grow up in tropical North Queensland in Australia. All of the rumors are true. I used to fish frogs out of the toilet bowl and dodge snakes that hung from the ceiling. So I was very lucky in that I was imbued with a deep appreciation of the natural world from a very early age, and nature was never an other for me. But when I was 11, I started watching documentaries. I watched The Cove, I watched An Inconvenient Truth by Al Gore, and it was like this kind of reality bubble suddenly being popped. And everything that I'd held to be true, everything that I knew to be loved, I suddenly realized was under incredible threat. And that's a super confronting thing to come up against when you're really, really young. And I think that's the reality for so many young climate activists entering into this space. So if anything, I was filled with this kind of despair and overwhelm. And yet within me was ignited this kind of fire and this conviction to be a voice for the voiceless and to commit the rest of my life to doing this. So I found my mode of activism not in banner blazing, but going down the slightly more subversive route, first in kind of documentary and filmmaking, and then in working within the UN, lobbying stuffy politicians into waking up to the urgency of this emergency. And really became fascinated when I was about 16 with this idea that, you know, the greatest threat we faced wasn't, in fact, the climate crisis, but our feeling of powerlessness in the face of it. And so from that point on, it really became my mission to understand how to mobilize mindsets en masse and how to shift a lot of that anxiety and overwhelm that we feel into a really clear sense of agency and purpose that goes beyond kind of token actions to really demanding for systemic change.
Both of you began this so young. I assume that your families and your parents were supportive?
Yeah. Yeah, definitely some friction at certain points. But I think by and large, when anyone begins to sit down and actually look at the science and look at the facts, it's impossible not to support your young people. And I think what keeps a lot of parents from being supportive is fear that they're going to scare their children and a desire to really protect them. And yet I think we can appreciate at this point that, you know, it's impossible to run away from the facts. You know, I had my 6-year-old cousin come up to me the other day and ask, you know, what's the deal with climate change and am I going to have a future? I want to wrap my arms around her and say everything will be fine, but I can't. And so I think a lot of parents are kind of struggling with that at the moment. But by and large, mine have been very, very supportive.
Yeah.
Alexandria, yeah, I want to come back to where you left off in telling your origin story. And maybe you could talk a bit about your parents here as well. But after all of this happened with the fire, you went to New York City and you were inspired by Greta Thunberg and you joined something called Fridays for Future, which meant that you were leaving school, you were skipping school on Fridays to demonstrate outside the United Nations. And this led you to becoming one of the organizers of the first global youth climate strike in 2019. Talk to us a bit about what that was like for you, what the reaction was. And then I want to bring it back to how we're all in lockdown now and how we're able to continue to make our voices heard. So tell us about how that evolved.
Yeah, of course. So the main reason I ended up going to New York City was my mom was studying in climate science at Columbia. And so, of course, when I ended up moving to New York City, I had this fantasized idea of what would it be like. And I didn't exactly realize what my mom was studying at the time because I was too busy fantasizing about taking long walks in Central Park, just this very Californian idea of New York City. And so when I got there, it was only a little while after getting back from it. Since I was really sick, I was staying home for a couple of days, that there was one of the days when my mom ended up taking me to some of the classes with her. And so I got to see climate science from the college level, which I think was really cool. And it was also another reason that I realized that getting to know climate science, you have to major in it. You don't really learn a lot about it in school. It's only a topic you can major in college, which it needs to be more accessible and more people need to hear about it at a younger age. So that was one thing that I realized, of course. But my mom and I, it was really cool because she took the academic perspective, and seeing this academic portion of climate, I realized that I thought I had this different perspective of it. I wanted to take the action. I wanted to take direct action because I wanted to see change, and that's how I saw we could see change the best is by taking direct action. Seeing what was happening to this planet, it was almost just like, why are we sitting in this room just learning about it? Why aren't we going to do something? And I think that that's what I brought to the table. And so with the support that my family, of course, gave me once I wanted to take direct action, it made me realize just how much adult allies are so important, because it's hard to do activism without family and parents who are supportive. And so adult allies are one of the greatest supporters that we have in this movement, because they can amplify our message. they can help promote our message, and they can join us when we're protesting in the street. And so that is so important, and I'm really grateful that my family was as supportive as they were. And when it comes to the movement now, especially in the youth climate movement, we have done a lot of reflection. So we've had conversations about what makes a demonstration and what made the Fridays for Future movement what it was. Was it the number of people? Was it the demands? And so we have done all of these conversations, and we have started to try and reinvent the way we take action while we're at home. So of course, the digital Fridays for Future strikes, where people took a picture and posted it, and even though it wasn't that direct action, it still raised awareness. And as well, there have been just some new ideas about how someone came up with wanting to break the Guinness World Record on largest Zoom call or phone call, because that would bring attention, and that would technically be an action that we could take. So we have started to use social media as our greatest resource and tool.
Clover, what about you? A lot of the work that you've done with your organization for, I think, the last year or so has focused on schools, and schools, of course, are now online. How have you shifted, and how are you thinking about activism in, an era where we can't leave our homes?
Yeah, so at Force of Nature, we first started going into schools in the UK about a year ago. And really, our mandate was to mobilize mindsets and to support young people to step up. But the thing that really, really struck us as we entered into the classroom was this climate anxiety. And just these very, very dystopian visions of the future, a sense of overwhelm, young people speaking to this level of abandonment from their parents and people in positions of authority in the context of the climate crisis. I had 11-year-olds telling me that they weren't going to go to university because of climate change. I had a 14-year-old girl tell me that she wasn't going to have children because there wouldn't be a planet for them to grow up on. So in working directly with young people, we realized that there was this kind of deep-seated stress and fear and grief about the issues. And so from that point on, we really started supporting young people in cultivating their intrapersonal intelligence and their emotional resilience, because that's one piece of this that really isn't talked about. Young people stepping up and into this challenge in a really incredible way, but being squashed in the process because of just how heavy it is. And of course, that's why so many of us have anesthetized ourselves to the problems. It's really, really painful to look in the face of both the damage that we've inflicted onto the planet and the damage we continue to inflict. And I think in the context of COVID, we've taken all of our programs online, which has enabled us to reach young people in underserved communities that we wouldn't have otherwise, which is incredible. But with that, we've also seen this explosion in mental health difficulties. I think for a lot of young people, that's friction at home, it's disconnect from their friends. It's for a number of youth strikers, as Alexandria was touching on, they kind of found their outlet through this grassroots mobilizing and through taking to the street. And that was their clear pathway for agency. Suddenly you take that away, that container away, the anxiety continues to mount, and yet you don't have that direct path forward. So really what we're trying to do as well is support young people in finding what those alternative strategies are and looking outside of that kind of frame of conventional grassroots protests to see, how do I really show up with my unique skills and talents and passions in the age of technology when we have all of these gifts at our fingertips, to demand the actions that are required, but to also kind of ideate around the solutions and try to change the world from our living room. So it's definitely been a real shift, but we're seeing it as an opportunity to be able to support that many more young people in their mental health.
It's so interesting because, beyond climate change, this is such a trying, stressful, grief-stricken time. And Clover, I kept thinking of you because you grew up in Australia. There were these awful wildfires. They barely ended, and then COVID happened. I'm curious, how are each of you holding up in your personal lives? lives. How are you getting through this? How do you find joy? Do you have any advice for the rest of us on building resilience?
Yeah,
Clover, let's start with you since you're on screen.
I'm not gonna lie and say that it's been easy and that it's been the most productive period of my life, because it's been really, really difficult. And yeah, within the context of the fires as well, I think interesting that was really Alexandria's catalyst moment, because similarly, I've never felt such a depth of powerlessness as I did in November of last year, living in London, looking back to my home in Australia, seeing it on fire and knowing that it would never again be the same. And I had to go through a grieving process to be able to get through that and get out the other side of it. And I think, as activists, we often learn to kind of beat our feelings into submission because we have to be switched on, we have to be inspired, and we have to engage other people. And that often means that you kind of forget about yourself. And so that was really a moment of hibernation for me to grieve what I was losing and to check in with myself. And I kind of feel the same way about COVID, and that I've really had to become comfortable with not being okay all the time and vacillating between this entire palette of emotions, whether that is waking up with a sense of anxiety and despair, or it's having one of those really productive days. And I think just the big thing for me has really been letting go of control. And it's interesting as well, because I think in the climate space, I have such a clear sense of agency that that's what keeps me going. But in the context of COVID, when you go on Twitter for 5 minutes and kind of get sucked into that vortex, it's near impossible not to be depressed by the statistics and figures, largely because they're so far beyond your control. We look to leadership, we see the negligence, we see the irresponsibility, and that can just feel crippling. So for me, my advice has really been in holding the space for those emotions, not resenting any one of them, becoming friends with them, and also really focusing what is in my control rather than allowing myself to spiral about what's going on out there and what isn't.
Alexandria, how about you? How are you doing?
Yeah, I think that staying at home for all of this time, it's definitely been hard. Usually activism, I've loved organizing and taking action just because it gives me that outlet for climate anxiety. And it's just staying at home, it makes me feel down if I don't have something to do or going on. And so I have put a lot of energy into working with Earth Uprising during this time because there's so many amazing people who I've grown friends with in Earth Uprising. So staying connected with those I care about is one thing that has gotten me through this, as well as I have made sure to stay connected with nature as much as possible. I think that that's really important to be connected with the environment while still social distancing. So in Davis, there's this experimental garden where people can buy up this tiny plot of land and grow plants and crops, and there's even chickens there. And so every once in a while, I'll go there and just walk through the garden, and it's really refreshing, and it makes me feel so much better just going out to the environment. And this time of year, Davis, we have an arboretum, and this time of year there's always new ducklings. So I always like to go there and see the little ducks because they're just so cute, and it's always refreshing. And so I think that the two things that are really important this time is your relationships with people. So definitely grow those and make people. That way, when we come out of this, those are so much stronger, but then in the climate movement, it's so much stronger. And then stay connected with the environment so we still know what we're fighting for when we come out of this.
Amazing. That's, I think, great advice for anyone. It's hard not to notice when learning about activism in this space, learning about some of the leaders, learning about some of the youth leaders, how many of them are young women. Do you both think that's an accident?
I'm going to let you take that one, Alexandria.
Yeah, of course. So there are a lot of young women who are leading this climate movement in the United States, but just all around the world. And I don't know exactly why that is. I do think that it's incredible seeing young women taking the lead and leading by example, because I've just gotten to meet so many strong and amazing women in this movement. And so I do think, however, that I love the United Nations approach, and especially Jayathma, the UN Youth Envoy. She always talks about how educating young women is one of the key to solving the climate crisis, because women are the caretakers of their home. And so once you educate women, you start to see a change in your community. And so I definitely think that that is an approach that we have to take. And that's why I find education such a key as well. And so when it comes to why these young women ended up leading this movement, I think that it's just because once we saw what was happening, we found each other, we found other young women like us, and we started working together. And I just love everyone who I've met. I don't know exactly, though, why it's young women.
Well, it's amazing that it is. I imagine that you both are often speaking to groups of older adults. And I guess one question for you is, how can we as adults, as policymakers, as thought leaders, support and empower you?
It's an excellent question. And from my perspective, I would say, as Alexandria touched on, not only do we need allies across generations, but in fact, that intergenerational exchange is where the magic happens. And my experience working in boardrooms with leaders is that, I used to subscribe to this kind of belief system that they were fundamentally bad and greedy, and they were there because they wanted to hurt the environment, they wanted to hurt people, a very black and white mode of thinking. And I quickly came to realize that the same self-limiting beliefs, the same I can't make a difference, I'm too small to make a difference that I was hearing from 11-year-olds in the classroom, I was also hearing from the chief executives of these huge organizations. And so I realized that, we're all largely in the same boat. And I don't think it's enough to kind of point the finger and say, you're bad and I'm good and you're wrong and I'm right. We all want to make a difference. We all want to take action on these issues. Some of us are in more denial than others. But by and large, if you invite people to the table and you have an open conversation, not just focusing on the challenges that present themselves, but on the future that is possible, on the opportunities that present themselves in this crisis, and you invite each and every person to be part of that 7.6 billion piece puzzle and step up into their potential, you can have incredible things happen. And so I would say to young activists, there is absolutely that desire. There are your allies in those older generations. You just have to find them. And equally, the older generations, I've been so inspired in really getting involved in the climate movement and just seeing how articulate and smart and capable young people are. I have 11-year-olds in the classroom talking to me about climate change being a systemic problem, the symptom of broken systems, and why we need a circular economy and why we need to rethink value in society. So their depth of knowledge is incredible. And if anything, the one thing that we can learn from young people is the energy, the passion, the uncompromising resolve. It's the moral absolutism of saying this is wrong and this is right, and I'm not going to make any mental gymnastics. I'm just going to act on what I know to be true, and each and every one of us needs to dial into that, regardless of how old we are or where we come from.
Alexandria, I want to end on a call to action. And Clover, feel free to jump in as well. But what is one thing we can all do when we leave here today? What is one action we can take, no matter our age or who we are?
Yeah, so I think that I first want to start off telling a little bit about what's happening in this current moment and what we can do after. And so on Tuesday, more than 200 organizations representing at least 40 million health workers signed an open letter to the G20 leaders to ensure recovery from the coronavirus that takes account of air pollution and climate breakdown. So air pollution has made the virus worse because it's already unhealthy, and so much so that air pollution has actually made the coronavirus worse. And even though the coronavirus pandemic has caused global emissions to drop by 17%, this is not only enough, but it's also temporary, and it will go up. It will go back up when we end up resuming normal activity. So we need a green recovery that supports industries and infrastructure that reduces greenhouse gas emissions and phases out polluters. So when we leave here, one thing I think that is so important is we must reimagine what we want our system to look like after this virus, and reimagine how climate change has an impact in coronavirus recovery.
Absolutely. Yeah. And just building on that, I think, as we press pause on our hyper-consumptive, globalized, throwaway culture, we have an opportunity. We have an opportunity to think about the future that we want to emerge into, and we have an opportunity to think about what it is that we want to leave behind. And as governments design their stimulus packages, we get to decide who gets bailed out and who is supported and who is given a lifeline. And it's the same for each and every one of us. We get to think about, as individuals, in collective, in community, where we want to be on the other side of this. And I'm gunning for a thriving planet where the decisions we make for ourselves are also those that are good for the planet. So take this opportunity to reflect on where you want to emerge out the other side of COVID and bring that future into the present.
Clover and Alexandria, you are amazing. Thank you so much for being here with us. To everyone tuning in, if you missed anything, there will be a recording of all of this that you can watch and rewatch. And up next, we will be tackling the frontline gender gap in healthcare. Thank you so much for being here.